The calm of the empty bowl. Once upon a time, in the gentle hills of a hidden valley, there lived an old man named One. He lived alone in a small wooden cabin, where the beams creaked like trees whispering to the wind, and the silence was as thick as the morning fog. One didn't own much: a clay teapot, a wooden bowl, a straw bed, and a flute made with his own hands. But he was never seen sad, anxious, or rushed. The villagers said One held the secret to peace, though he never spoke a word about it. He simply smiled, as if everything that existed was enough. In the mornings, One would fetch water from the stream with his bowl and pour it into the teapot with slow movements, as if each drop held eternity. Then he would sit facing the rising sun, close his eyes, and simply breathe. Nothing more, nothing less. And although many had traveled long distances to ask him how to find happiness, he only offered tea and silence. One day, a young man named Liang arrived at the cabin. His steps were quick, his breath short, and his eyes carried the weight of many questions. He had heard about the Old One and his mysterious serenity, and longed to understand how someone could live with so little and still feel complete. "Master One," he said, bowing respectfully, "I have crossed mountains and rivers. My heart is full of restlessness. I want to know how to find peace. Will you teach me?" One looked at him kindly, saying nothing. He went inside his cabin and returned with his wooden bowl. He handed it to the young man empty. Then, with a gentle gesture, he pointed to the nearby stream. "Just this?" Liang asked, somewhat confused. One nodded, and with a slight smile, he sat down on a rock and closed his eyes, as if nothing more needed to be said. Liang, somewhat perplexed, took the bowl and walked toward the stream, wondering if the lesson had already begun. The stream water was as clear as the autumn sky. Liang crouched down and carefully dipped the bowl into the water. As he did, he noticed how the leaves floated gently on the current, offering no resistance. They were in no hurry. They had no direction. They simply flowed. When he returned with the bowl full, One said nothing. He just watched him and, with a slight wave of his hand, invited Liang to sit beside him. Minutes passed, or perhaps hours. Silence wrapped around everything like a warm blanket. Liang began to feel restless. He expected wise words, instructions, some secret formula that would reveal the path to peace. But One remained still, motionless, breathing with the rhythm of the wind, eyes closed, and a serene face. Finally, the old man opened his eyes, looked at the bowl in the young man's hands, and asked softly, "Is it full?" Liang looked at the water and replied, "Yes, master, full of fresh water." One nodded and said, "When the bowl is full, it cannot receive anything more." Then he closed his eyes again. Liang didn't fully understand, but something inside him began to calm. The day passed without words. The sun slowly moved across the sky, and the shadows of the trees stretched over the earth like thoughts dissolving in the mind. Liang stayed beside One, watching, listening, unsure exactly what he was meant to learn. Yet he was beginning to feel different. When the sky turned orange, One stood up and went into his cabin. After a short while, he returned with 2 small cups and the steaming teapot. He poured the tea with steady hands, silently, without hurry. Liang watched him, intrigued by every movement. The way he poured the tea was so slow, so complete, it seemed like a sacred act. "Master," he dared to ask, "why don't you teach me with words? Why the silence?" One smiled and pointed to the steam rising from the cup. "Can you catch the steam with your hands?" Liang shook his head. "That's how words are when the mind is too full. They just slip away." He took his cup, sipped, and added, "First, you have to empty the bowl." so the essence can be received. Liang lowered his gaze. For the first time in a long while, his mind began to quiet. That night, Liang slept in a corner of the cabin, wrapped in a handmade blanket and accompanied by the song of crickets and the whisper of the wind through the branches. There were no lanterns. There were no closed doors. Only the gentle darkness of the mountain and the serene warmth of the slow-burning fire. At dawn, the young man woke before one. He stepped outside and sat facing the open landscape. For the first time, he didn't feel the urge to understand anything. He simply breathed. The dew sparkled on the leaves like tiny moons. The world seemed at peace, not because everything was perfect, but because everything was enough. When one came out, he found him like that, motionless, calm, eyes closed. The old man said nothing. He just sat beside him, letting the morning unfold effortlessly. After a long silence, Liang whispered, "Master, is this living simply?" One nodded slightly and replied, "Living simply is not having little. It is needing little." Liang stayed in the cabin for several days. At first, he tried to help, gathering firewood, cleaning the floor, asking if one needed anything. But the old man always answered with the same phrase, "Do only what is necessary, no more, no less." It was hard for the young man at first. He was used to doing, searching, chasing after something. But little by little, the stillness of the place enveloped him. The days stopped being a checklist and became a vast space, like a cloudless sky. One afternoon, while washing the bowl in the stream, Liang looked at it carefully. It was simple. No decorations, no shine, no pretensions. And yet, in its emptiness, it could hold water, light, shadow, even reflect the sky. In that moment, he understood. It wasn't the bowl that mattered, but the space it offered. He returned to the cabin without saying a word. One looked at him and, for the first time, bowed his head with a deeper smile, as one who sees something they have been silently waiting for finally bloom. That night, Liang needed no blanket, no fire, no words. He lay down on the soft earth, gazing at the stars. He didn't think about the future. He didn't relive the past. He simply felt the sky breathing with him. The next morning, upon waking, he knew it was time to leave. One was sitting as always, with his flute in his hands. Liang bowed with gratitude and said, "Thank you, Master. You gave me no answers, but I no longer have questions." One nodded and offered him the wooden bowl. "Take it with you. Let it remind you that emptiness is not lack, but space to receive." Liang accepted the bowl and held it like a treasure, not for its material value, but for what it now represented. Calm presence, the simple abundance of needing nothing more than the essential. He began to descend the mountain without hurry. Each step was light, each breath enough, and for the first time he felt he carried peace with him, not as an object but as a way of walking. Liang returned to his village, but he was no longer the same. His steps were slow, his gaze serene, and his words few, like drops that fall only when needed. He didn't speak much about his time with Master One. He simply placed the empty bowl on a shelf by the window, where the morning light could fill it every day. He didn't use it for anything, and yet it was always full of silence, of space, of peace. Over time, others began to notice something different in Liang. He no longer rushed. He didn't compete. He didn't complain. When asked about his secret, he simply smiled and offered a cup of tea. And if the visitor was patient, sometimes in the silence between sips, something deep was revealed. Because in simplicity, Liang would say while looking at the bowl, one loses nothing. One only discovers that they already had everything. And so, in a village like any other, the echo of the Tao continued its journey. not in words, but in the quiet presence of a young man who had learned to live like water, effortlessly, without excess, without fear.